So on the spending side, if we go back to that for a minute, obviously defense is a category, the legislature itself is a category, paying for Congress itself, the judiciary is a category, right? These are, in my mind, are very clear categories. Then we start to get into other kind of murkier, overlapping categories. In your mind, how do you think about the buckets of the budget and what they should be?
Okay. In 1974, the Congressional Budget Act divided the budget into about 15 buckets, calling them functions. Defense was one, environment was another, health care was a third one, Medicare was a separate one, actually. Okay. Over time, Congress didn't repeal that provision, but downgraded it. So within Congress, they really no longer talk about these buckets of money. Instead, they talk about discretionary spending divided into defense and non-defense. Those are two buckets, defense and non-defense discretionary spending. And then payments for individuals, what we call entitlements. And finally, interest on the public debt. Those are the buckets which tend to be used today. Arguably, and maybe they're too broad to really enable us to make rational decisions. But here's the advantage for Congress. The more buckets you have, the more fight you have also. And so the fewer buckets, the easier it is to put together a budget.
So within this, non-military discretionary bucket, which would seem to contain most of the categories that we would think of, in your mind, is there a logical construct of what those categories should be?
Well, they pretty much correspond to the operational work of government, and I don't want to put labels on them, but I want to make a different point. The amount spent on this category, non-defense discretionary spending, which in non-technical terms means the amount Congress appropriates every year for the operational costs of government. That has been declining as a percentage of the economy and as a percentage of the budget. And there are a number of ways of the decline is very severe. We're talking about this category, which is the most, generates the most controversy in Congress, accounts for about a little more than 3% of the gross domestic product of the United States. Okay. Why has it declined? One obvious reason is because other parts of the budget, the entitlements have grown so large. But there's another reason why it's declined, which has a lot to do with probing that you've been making. Okay. It's a referendum on the regard of Americans for government. Okay. Show me two graphs. One is trust and confidence in leaders and institutions. The other graph, spending on government on what we call non-discretionary, non-defense discretionary spending. The two graphs trended the same way. And so part of the budgetary difficulty that we face is we're at a period of a low trough, I can say, in regarding trusting governments and their leaders.
So it's interesting that, when we talk about this trust element of Congress, and then at the same time, they've also had to reach out. Part of that might be coming from the investment in themselves, right? If you look at Congress's own appropriation for itself, in my view, might be too low to even have the expertise to make a budget, right? And so they've seem to have reached out to the executive to mandate that the executive come up with a budget, right, that they can then react to. They've sort of outsourced this first draft, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about that process, how, I mean, the Constitution says that the House should come up with the budget. Now it seems the president does. How did this happen? And what do you think the appropriate role of the president is in this process?
Well, actually, the Constitution is silent about a budget because the concept of budgeting arose after the Constitution was written. The president had to send a statement of finances to Congress, but it could have been a statement retrospective. This is what we spent last year. A budget is prospective. Okay. And through the 19th century, federal agencies would go directly to their favorite congressional committee and ask what they want. The president had a relatively limited role, etc. 1 year ago, 100 years ago, next week, 2 weeks from now, rather, okay, the president signed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which put the president front center in budgeting. Congress cannot receive spending requests directly from federal agencies, only from the president. Okay, and that's been the role of the president ever since. Okay, but what is the actual role? Not the legal one. Okay, I would say this. Okay, the political job of the president is to make the budgetary work of Congress easier rather than harder. And the reason for that is Congress is 535 people. That's why Congress shifted responsibilities to the president. We can't do it. Just think, Congress is a committee with 535 people, divided into two committees, subcommittees, House and Senate, divided into other committees. Committees can never come up with a budget, not even in a company, Okay, they can't do it. Okay, so the job of the president is to make things politically easier for Congress. Okay, I can tell you that in recent times, presidents have not behaved in this way. You may be familiar with a phenomenon which media point to, again, DOA budgets, dead on arrival budgets. What is a dead on arrival budget? A political statement that serves the president's interest, even at the expense of making it harder for Congress. I'm not talking about President Biden or President Trump or President Obama. This is a trend which has been going on for a period of years, making it harder for Congress to come together and make decisions. Now, I can't tell you how it will play out in the case of the incumbent of President Biden, because he has one perspective or advantage compared to almost every recent president. He's a person of Congress. He thinks as a member of Congress. And there's one thing that a member of Congress thinks of, except for the few ideologues. How do I compromise? How do I compromise? To be a legislator is to be a compromiser. And so I think in this regard, we may find at the end of the day, as a matter of fact, look how many compromises Biden has publicly made already. Media call it weakness. What really is Biden's congressional behavior. You know, he understands that, okay? Which means that there's a real potential that Biden will make things easier for Congress rather than harder. I can't promise that because, as I said earlier, the two parties are so distant from each other that, compromise occurs when the two parties are in the same room talking to each other. And that doesn't often happen these days.
Well, any closing thoughts on the budget before we move on to our other questions? Obviously you've spent a long time thinking about it and you've been an architect of it, and any thoughts on where it could go, how it could be improved, what an ideal budget would be, any thoughts that you could share with us on that subject?
Yeah, okay, I will say this. We will not pay attention to either the machinery of budgeting or the process or the policies of budgeting in a serious way until or unless interest rates rise. As long as interest rates are low, there is no pressure on Congress, not from the financial markets and not from the American voters, for Congress to do anything. Continue on the current course. If and when, this is not a prediction about interest rates, I frankly don't know the direction they'll move. But unless they move, then now, you know better than I that they're rock bottom, close to zero, borrowing cost to the federal government. And for, personal mortgages of people, I refinanced my home for 2.5% for 30 years, like that. At such time, if interest rates rise, then Congress will say, what do we have to do to correct our budgetary behavior? If they don't rise, you're not going to hear that argument at all.
All right. So are you ready to move on then to our,
Yes.
our
Go
lightning
ahead.
round of
Matthew,
questions that I
go
asked?
ahead. If I can't answer them, I'll try anyway.
All right. We're moving off of budgeting now into areas maybe you
Mhm.
talk less on. So,
Okay.
but I ask these questions of all of our guests, and then ultimately I can compare the answers and see the diversity that exists among the scholarly community and others. My first question is about representation. So what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Well, okay. I think it has to be an amalgam of two features, and this is not a new question. Edmund Burke, in his famous address to the electors of Bristol, almost 200 years ago, addressed that question. An obligation to the people who put you in office and an obligation to the country. Okay. That relationship is imbalanced by a third factor, campaign finance. I am convinced, I don't know if people agree with me, that unless you change campaign finance laws, okay, members running for Congress, elected, already incumbents or challengers, will not be able to properly balance the interests of the country and the demands of their constituents. Okay. Consider this. If you're not a Senate running for a Senate office, a congressional office in a metropolitan office, a congressman, you got to produce $5 to $10 million of money to have a credible campaign. Okay? You get beholden to so many interests. You don't realize how beholden you are to them. So we have imbalanced this, and I know we've left budgeting. You want to improve budgeting, improve campaign finance.
So it sounds to me like you're a Burkean at heart, then, that you represent everybody in your district and you make judgments about what you think is in their best interest. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, what about what we talked about earlier? Do you represent your district's people today, or do you represent the future of that district as well?
It's very hard to represent the future. Those voters are not born yet. They don't vote. And the demand you hear are from people around the corner, people who send you letters, people who drop in at your local office. And as you may know, Congress has been reorganized silently over the last generation in the following ways. An increasing portion of congressional staff don't work in Washington. They work in home offices, district offices, state offices, storefront offices, mobile offices. Okay, they don't do legislative work. They do what we call casework. Okay, and that's part of the imbalanced situation. So I'm not optimistic that we can have due regard for the future. That is precisely the reason, Matthew, why we have imposed limits. If members of Congress were given due regard to future generations, we wouldn't need budget limits. There would be what you said earlier about the balanced budget norm 100, 200 years ago, they would be internalized. Precisely because they're not internalized, we need limits to compensate for the fact that we do not give due regard to the future.
My next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And by that, I mean between legislation, oversight, campaigning, in DC, out of DC.
Well, I think in that question requires that you consider the vastly enlarged role of party leaders. Okay? Because the role of party leaders has come to be that committees are not committees, members are not members. There's simply two stages in the process to get the thing on the desk of the president to be signed. Members of Congress do very little legislative work these days. This year, they're doing actually more than in quite a few years. But there's something anomalous. Last year, I know last year was a crazy year, 2020 was a presidential election year. Congress, near the end of the session, passed two bills, which totaled about over 4,000 statute pages, comprised 70% of the statute pages of that session of Congress. Two bills, The members of Congress did not know what was in the bill. They didn't pretend to know. The leadership knew, gatekeepers knew, That's not legislating. So it's a way of scrolling back to your question. I think we have to restore a bit more legislating to people who are designated as legislators.
So you'd increase the legislative time?
I don't think, no, we have to redistribute legislative power. We have to say that committees become more important again. The leadership has to have some forbearance. Now in order for that to happen, there has to be less polarization, etc. The leadership in both the House and Senate in different ways have an iron grip on what happens on the floor. You have to enable members, you have to give members a reason to say, I want to be a legislator. Because they have so much other things to do with their time. A large part of it is fundraising. I'll tell you a little story of my personal career. From 1972 to 1981, with a 2-year interruption to write a very fat book, 600-page book I wrote called Congress and Money, I worked for the Congressional Research Service. One of my responsibilities was to arrange seminars for members of Congress in the evening on a contemporary topic. Early in my career, we'd have 20, 40, 60 members of Congress attending these seminars to be educated, to listen to a panel discussing the various sides of the issue. By the end of my period in Congress, if we had 20 people coming to, these were dinner meetings, if 20 promised to come for dinner, at 5 o'clock we would call their offices, maybe 4 would show up. What were they doing? They were going from one fundraiser to another fundraiser that evening. Their own fundraisers and their colleagues' fundraisers, because you got to show the flag, etc. And so if you ask what eats up congressional time and limits your legislative capacity, it's 1, the lack of incentive because of the role of party leaders. 2, the time allocated to fundraising. 3, the time allocated to campaigning. Maybe what you should do, this is a straight thought, maybe it's foolish, schedule votes on Monday and Friday rather than don't schedule them on Monday and Friday. Because members of Congress are here 3 days and they're back home 4 days. Even if you're going from California or from Hawaii, you'll red eye it, they call it, to get back to Washington for Tuesday to be in town. These are important changes to make.
Great. Well, the next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? And it sounds like from your previous conversation, you think most of that discussion should happen in committee.
I think most of it has to happen in committee, but a lot of it can happen on the floor. The floor today, as I said before, is tightly regulated. How much discussion can you have on a 2,000-page bill where the floor time is 1 hour, period? So I would, I know we can think of the floor and committee as rival venues for decision making. I know that some say the bill becomes the law, goes to the committee, goes to the floor, but they really are competitive ways of making decisions. But I would like to see more time in committee and also more time on the floor.
And in terms of the way it would be structured, you've obviously seen it for so many years. Is there a structure to that debate that would work better? Is it 3 minutes for one side, 3 minutes for the other? Is it is it closed doors with no cameras on and discussion? What are the ways that people should be communicating?
No, debate is highly structured in both the House and Senate these days. Very highly structured, stylized is what you might call it. In the House, because any major legislation comes to the House, what's called a rule, and the rule defines or sets the terms and conditions under which the particular measure will be considered, the amount of time the amendments will be considered, and so on. In the Senate, often they have what's called unanimous consent agreements. The party leaders behind the scenes, as much as Democrats and Republicans fight, they often do reach agreement on certain matters. And when they reach agreement, again, it sets the terms and conditions under which the Senate debates a bill.
Great. So the next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to punt on that, partly because I'm thinking about can I make it through the next 10 years myself, but it really will depend on forces outside Congress. There's one rule I should have mentioned earlier to have a Congress. You want to know how Congress behaves inside the Capitol, find out what's happening outside the Capitol. Some of the big things might happen outside the Capitol. Okay, social trends, demographics, climate change, the place of the United States in the world. And perhaps the most important thing is how individual character and interests are molded by technology. Okay, every parent will tell you, or grandparent at least will tell you, that kids who at the age of 2 and 3 become adept in using electronic devices and living in a cocoon in which they can communicate within the same household rather than person to person, but texting each other. Okay, and they developed their own world. We're living in a world of powerful individualism. And the purpose of Congress is to make collective choice. That, to me, is the greatest challenge of the future. Individualism has been put on a pedestal. Good. Look at the liberty it gives us. A mobile phone, a cell phone gives you freedom from space. And as we know from the pandemic, freedom even from workspace very often. Freedom from family, freedom from other connections. This is wonderful, but it's inevitable that it will have an impact on the way an institution which is fundamentally established to make collective decisions. Every bill enacted by Congress begins with the preamble in Congress assembled. We're living in a world in which we don't assemble anymore. That's a problem for Congress.
So do you have well, on the technologies on the other side can provide a means for collective decision-making, right? Through all kinds of mechanisms,
Oh, yeah.
right? So
Oh, yes.
there is a flip side, but I agree, it's a different kind, it's a more of a mechanistic aggregation of information rather than a face-to-face relationship-based discussion.
We look, we're moving toward it. Mail voting, voting weeks in advance, transforms voting into something people staying in a long line to vote, etc. The technology you refer to is tailor-made for plebiscitary voting, in which, as I'm doing right now, sitting at my computer, I can be given a choice. It can be coded to protect that this is this individual making a decision which will be confidential on a public policy question. And within the time frame, 100 million or more Americans are similarly voting in that issue. We haven't barely begun to scratch the surface of using technology for collective choice. I'm not saying we should, I'm saying we haven't.
Right. Well, great. Well, the next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I'm hard pressed to think which.
You mentioned earlier your economist. Was it your rational choice influence from the early days of collective decision making? Was that something that put you in the direction of budgeting?
No. Here's the reason. Here's the reason why I'm punting on it. And that is reforms have not been successful. And on the other side of the ledger, it's very easy to propose a reform. There are hundreds of books published each year about policy reforms. It's I have to tell you a joke. In 1993, when Bill Clinton was elected president, he appointed Al Gore as his vice president. And to keep the vice president out of trouble, he put him in charge of something, a reinventing government project. And I was called to a meeting at the White House with about 20 other people with Gore. And he began the meeting saying, each of you go around the room, identify yourself. And say, I'm Allen Schick. I'm a pathologist of failed government reforms, and business has been very good. Okay. So I'm reluctant to, the flip side of the coin is so much of my career was trying to devise reforms and to promote reforms and to market reforms. So I'm not being critical of others. I'm shining the spotlight on myself and saying that I have so many disappointments about reforms that I'm reluctant to recommend something for others.
Well, the good news about Congress is that in theory, it can change its rules at any time, right? So there's always the possibility to change.
That's good news. And of course, with respect to the Senate, the big question is changing the filibuster rule, because that's carried over from one Congress to another Congress. But I don't think that rules changes alone will suffice. As I'm repeating what I said earlier, to understand what happens inside Congress, you must understand what's happening outside Congress. And these powerful social trends, the mobilization of demands, the proliferation of intergroups, what a colleague of mine once called hyperpluralism, or he actually had another term, dermosclerosis. He called it the disease of democracy. Has a great impact on Congress.
Great. Well, my last question is, your plans. Do you have another book in you? What's the what are you going to do in the next, in the coming years?
Well, at the age of 87, you're fortunate that you have a large extended family. My extended family extends me, so to speak. I'm talking at this interview, having spent the last few days at a wedding of one grandchild, preparing the wedding of a second grandchild, going to engagement parties for a great nephew and a great niece, visiting 3 different branches of my extended family. That's just the last few days. And fortunately, you scheduled this interview, so I have to be grounded back home.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure and really great, and appreciate all the work that you've done in this area. It's really been fantastic to read it and to talk to you in person.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I appreciate the opportunity.